Hey, I'm Megan. I just wanted to share my story today because when I was in a really rough spot, we had a good friend of ours share his recovery story with us, and it is pretty much what saved us. We wouldn't have known where to get the help we needed without it. And even when I started recovery, we heard people's stories that helped to give me hope that I could be in a better spot one day. And so I just want to share our story to hopefully give you maybe some guidance and some hope if you are currently struggling. My story with pornography addiction and betrayal trauma started, I met my husband at work, and we dated, and we got pretty serious and decided to get married. He did tell me before we got married that he had struggled some with pornography as a teenager, but he made it sound like it was a pretty past issue, and it's not something that thrilled me to hear, but I didn't really want to judge him or hold him, condemn him for things he'd done in the past. And so I went ahead with it, and we got married, and we had a great start, a lot of fun together. I really was enjoying our marriage a lot. A few years in, this will date us a little bit. A few years in, he got a smartphone. So we existed before smartphones. And it wasn't too long after he got a smartphone that he started to struggle with pornography again. When I found out about it, I was pretty heartbroken. For some people that sounds kind of silly, like how can you be hurt by somebody just looking at images, but I was pretty heartbroken. I felt like I was grieving. I felt like I was grieving the loss of the marriage I thought I had. And he was pretty surprised by how hard it hit me as well, and he promised he wasn't going to ever do it again. And so we just kind of moved on, swept it under the rug, went on with our lives. And after we'd been married 4 or 5 years, we decided to start having a family. So I became pregnant with our son. And during that time, I just started to feel kind of a disconnect from my husband, Jeffrey. He was there, and he still treated me well, but it was like I couldn't really reach him, like he was kind of far away somewhere. And I finally pointed it out to him and got talking with him and discovered that his pornography addiction had gotten worse again. And that was hard to hear, just on the verge of having our first child, in a pretty vulnerable spot. Anyways, we had our son, and Jeffrey was a really cute and sweet dad with him, and we just kind of did the best we could. As most of you, if any of you that have children know, they're wonderful, and it's an adjustment for your marriage when you have a child. And so between the pornography use and the adjustment to parenthood, and I had some pretty severe postpartum depression as well. So between those things, things started to go downhill really for the first time. And after a while, we just it happened really gradually, and almost like to where you couldn't notice it, but we started fighting more, started just not being as good of friends anymore. All my focus was kind of on the baby, so things just kind of gradually started getting worse and worse. We had our second child, our little girl, a few years later, who we love so much, both of them. And our little girl, she was pretty fussy baby, and we didn't get really any sleep for a really long time with her. So that kind of just compounded our deteriorating marriage state, mental state. I didn't really know it, but around that time, Jeffrey, he did do better with his pornography use for a while after she was born, but shortly thereafter he started to get in probably deeper than he, I don't know, I think deeper than he ever has. And I didn't really know, I didn't really ask, I didn't want to know. I was just kind of in a survival mode, trying to take care of the kids and keep us going every day. And but like I said, things just started to gradually kind of fall apart. Jeffrey he had always been really kind, big heart, but he started to not treat me as well sometimes, and it upset me, and it wasn't something that I'd experienced before with him, and so it was really hard. With my faith, I believe strongly in staying in a marriage, unless there's abuse or whatnot, and so even though things were getting worse, I stayed, and things eventually did get to the level of abuse, emotionally and psychologically at least, and it was a really hard time for all of us. Jeffrey really started to pull away from people. I didn't really understand it at the time, but I guess he was feeling so much shame over what he was doing, and that he just felt like everybody must be able to see what he was doing or see it, and so he was kind of pulling away from everybody so they wouldn't know or wouldn't find out. So when friends would invite us to do stuff, he would find a reason that we couldn't go. When we tried to go visit my family, he would find a reason why we couldn't go do that, and it got to where we weren't seeing anybody. We weren't interacting with hardly anybody. We were getting really isolated. And I didn't really understand what was happening. And it, like I said, happened so gradually too that I didn't realize how bad it was until it was really bad. We would get in fights, and he would get really upset, and I would ask him to leave until he was calmer, and he wouldn't. And I would try to leave, and he would block my vehicle in our driveway so that I couldn't leave. I just felt really trapped. And I knew sometimes I would, most of the time I just kind of put on a good face and pretended like everything was fine because I didn't really know what else to do. Sometimes I couldn't really hide it anymore, and the denial would break down, and I would realize how bad things were. But I felt pretty helpless to be able to do anything about it. I kind of guessed that pornography was the issue of why he was acting differently. But if I would try to confront him about it or ask him about it, he would get really defensive, wouldn't really ever give me a straight answer. So I just kind of continued on this path. And I remember praying one day that I would be able to figure out what was going on, and that I would be able to find out what we could do to fix it, and that if it was pornography, that I would know somehow, and I would be able to find out. And it was probably a few months later that I walked in on Jeffrey viewing pornography, and the situation that he was viewing it in let me know that at this point it wasn't an occasional thing anymore, that it was an addiction, and that it was serious, and just the circumstances at the moment. And so even though that moment of discovery was really painful, it was also a big relief to finally know what was really going on, and where my husband was. And so at that time I reached out to a friend of ours who has shared his story publicly about his pornography addiction, and was a good friend to us, and just kind of asked him, where do I start, you know? So I went to specialized therapy with someone that specializes in pornography addiction and betrayal trauma. I started to go. Jeffrey was not real excited at first to get going with therapy. His friend kind of pulled him into it, and he went reluctantly for quite a while. But it really started to help and change me. So I had someone I could finally tell what was going on. I'd kept kind of everything that was going on such a secret. that was a big relief, just to be able to have somebody to talk to about what was going on in my home. I joined a women's support group, and so every week I met with other women and a therapist, other women who were going through the same thing I was, and I could call them anytime if I was having a hard time, and it was such a relief to have a voice again, and to be able to not have everything in my home be a secret and not have to fake that I was okay anymore. That was a really big relief. So at first in therapy, I kind of felt like I didn't need to be there in the groups. I thought, I'm okay. I've been okay. I'm okay. I don't really need to be here. But that was big denial. I needed to be there so bad. And even though the addiction was his issue, it helped us both a lot for me to get help as well. I remember coming to a point in therapy where I realized that I could be happy and have a good life whether he chose to overcome his addiction or not. And that was a big turning point for me. Before that, I kind of had my happiness tied up into, if he got better, I could be happy, but if he chose not to, then I wouldn't be able to. And so that was a big turning point for me. Another big turning point for me was I read the book Codependent No More and learned a lot about codependency. And I know that codependency is kind of looked at as a negative term in the betrayal, trauma, recovery world sometimes. I think it's really misunderstood. So I think a lot of people think codependency means that you are partially to blame for somebody's addiction, or that you somehow helped cause it. And that's really not what codependency is at all. Codependency is when you live with somebody who has a really big problem, whether that problem is an addiction or a health problem, and the problem becomes so big that it starts to be your problem too, because it affects you. And since it's affecting you, you decide you want to try to fix it. But since it's not your problem, you can't fix it. And so you kind of get in this stuck spot. And that's where I was. I was super codependent with Jeffrey. And in a lot of my other relationships as well at the time. And so when I learned about that, I could start to do something about it. So one of the main things I did was I started to take care of myself. I had really neglected myself, just as a mom of young kids, and in this marriage I'd started to really neglect myself. I didn't take good care of myself at all anymore, and so I started to go on walks in the mornings before my kids got up and just enjoy the sunrise and nature. I started to do things for fun. Like I stopped cleaning and doing things I had to do every once in a while and just doing stuff that I enjoyed, like reading or sewing or things like that. I started doing yoga. I started listening to Christian rock music. I started to have friends again. I just started to do things to take care of me. I remember I did a project in group about codependency, and we were supposed to do some kind of visual representation of what our codependency looked like. And so I drew, my first picture I drew was myself, and I was bleeding all over, and I had a box of Band-Aids, and I was putting these Band-Aids all over Jeffrey while I was bleeding all over. And then in my second picture, I had put the Band-Aids on myself, and I had stopped bleeding. And so that's what curing my codependency was like for me. I let Jeffrey's problem be his problem, and I started to take good care of myself. I had been depressed for a really long time, and I had been in pretty hardcore denial about it. I actually work on a psychiatric unit with people who are suicidal, and I couldn't see that I was majorly depressed, and I was in big time denial about it. And I finally started on an antidepressant, and so I took care of that too, started taking care of that part of myself. And I know it doesn't work for everybody, but it was pretty amazing for me. I started to be able to laugh again. I remember my little boy saying something like, Mama, I didn't know you knew how to laugh. And so, yeah, I just started to take care of myself and put the Band-Aid on me instead of on Jeffrey. It was really hard at first to do that though, because he was kind of drowning at the time. He did really well at being sober from pornography from when he started treatment, and did really well with that, but at the same time he hadn't really learned any new ways to cope with his feelings yet, and so he was in this really vulnerable spot where he was awake and alive again and feeling all the pain that life has, and he didn't have any way to cope with it, and his anxiety got super high. He started having panic attacks, ended up in the ER with a panic attack. He started getting really anxious about germs and sicknesses, and kind of started to think he had a lot of sicknesses and was going to the doctor all the time. And so he was just in a really vulnerable spot when I kind of decided to back away and start taking care of me. And it was hard to watch him. It was really hard to watch him because I knew how hard he was struggling, and I wanted to help him, but knew I couldn't. And he was kind of used to me trying to help him, and he kind of felt abandoned. And so it was really hard spot to be in. And then the other thing I gained from the Codependent No More book is, she said, and the author of the book said, that you need to let yourself feel angry. And I'd kind of just, as a Christian, I just felt like when I found out about Jeffrey's addiction, that I just needed to forgive, be done with it. That's kind of what I'd done, and I'd never really let myself be angry. I was scared that if I let myself feel angry, that I might not ever stop feeling angry, and that I would be this bitter, nasty woman. And so I just really never let myself feel angry, but I decided to take the lady and the author's advice, and I let myself feel angry for a while, and I felt super angry. Once I let it out, it was bad. And so kind of at the time when Jeffrey really could use some support, I was a pissed off, non-supportive person. And it was kind of ugly. I couldn't really feel any empathy. I was just so angry. I was angry about what his addiction had done to us. I was angry about paying for treatment. I was angry about all these doctor visits he was going on that weren't for real illnesses and that we couldn't afford. And I was just angry all the time. And I wasn't sure if it was going to end, but it did. I think I just needed to let myself feel it. And once I'd let myself feel it, it eventually just kind of dissipated on its own, which I was really grateful for, because I think you can kind of get stuck there. But some other things that really helped me recover, other than overcoming codependency and taking good care of myself, I learned about some of my negative core beliefs that I had about myself. I think we all have some negative beliefs about ourselves. I didn't really have a lot of trauma per se as a child or in my life, but I think we all, whether we have abuse in our history or whatnot, I think we all end up with some wounds, even if we don't necessarily have trauma, we end up with some wounds that teach us different things about ourselves. We learn different things about ourselves through those wounds that may or may not be true. And so I did an assignment in group where I kind of learned what my beliefs about myself were that weren't really serving me well, and where they'd come from, what events in my life had caused me to believe those things about myself, so that I could kind of overcome those beliefs and be who I really wanted to be. So some of the beliefs that I had gained about myself throughout life was I had this really strong belief that I just wasn't enough, and that I just never would be. Through different events in my life kind of reinforced that, and the pornography addiction definitely reinforced that as well. I just felt like I wasn't enough. So that was one that I really worked hard to overcome. Another belief I had about myself was that my feelings didn't matter or were too much for people. So I tended to keep them to myself and not really share when I was hurting or needed help, and just kind of try to take everything on myself and fix everything myself. So those were probably the two main beliefs that I really worked on. overcoming in therapy to get to a good spot. I've been raised in a Christian home, and I strongly believed and had been taught that I was a child of God and that I had value and worth. And for some reason, it's not what I'd been taught, but for some reason I got this mistaken idea that God's love is only there for us if we've earned it, or if we have met some requirements, or whatnot. And so I kind of had lost sight of God's love for me, and I was able to get that back through this experience. I remember at one point when things were really bad, I remember there's a scripture in my religion that talks about a people who were in bondage. They were slaves, and they were burdened with lots of tasks, and they were just overwhelmed, and they were praying to God to have their burdens lifted or eased. And I remember in the scripture it says that he didn't immediately take away their burdens, but he strengthened them and made them stronger so that their burdens felt light, and so that they were strong enough to handle it. And I remember when things were really bad, I got to a point where I just prayed that this burden could be eased somehow, that I just couldn't carry it anymore. I had a lot of little miracles that happened that eased my burden, and that made it so that I could continue and that I could make it through. I just feel really blessed. Another huge piece of recovery for me was setting boundaries. I had not been good at setting boundaries with Jeffrey, and so I learned how to do that. And so when he would be emotionally abusive, I knew how to set boundaries to protect myself, and I started to set boundaries for myself. And not only did it help protect me, it actually helped Jeffrey recover as well, because he was able to see that some of his behavior towards me wasn't okay anymore. And so he was able to start making some choices if he wanted to continue doing those things or start acting differently. So it really helped a lot to set some boundaries to protect myself. I had to set some pretty hard ones sometimes. Probably one of the worst things that happened in all of it was one night he got really angry and started throwing a lot of stuff, and it was a pretty scary experience. And the next day I set a boundary that I wouldn't be treated that way out of anger. And I actually left with my two kids and went and stayed somewhere else for a while. It was so hard to do. I was scared that Jeffrey would hurt himself, or hurt me if he found out I was leaving, or it was just a terrifying experience. But it was also really liberating to stand up for myself and to know that I knew how to do that and could protect myself and my children, and that we would be okay. And he got to it helped him make a choice. It helped him choose, if he wanted to continue on his path or if he wanted to make some changes. And luckily for me, he decided to make some awesome changes. Yeah, I remember when I started therapy with my husband, that the therapist told us that someday we would be really glad that pornography addiction had happened to our family. And I just remember thinking in my head, bullshit. I will never be glad that this happened. But now, a few years later, I can truly say I'm so glad that this happened to our family. We learned and grew so much. My husband is a wonderful husband, a very loving, kind individual. He's learned so many things, and he's so wonderful with me and our kids. And I feel like I really found who I am and my purpose in life. Like I mentioned before, I work in mental health, and as a result of this experience, I decided to go back to school, and so I'm working on becoming a therapist myself now, and just feel like I have good direction and purpose and meaning in my life. And I just want to that life is still hard. You know, we still have hard things. We've had a lot of hard experiences in our lives this year as well. But I feel like we've gained so many ways to cope with it, and to so many new perspectives on life, that I'm no longer afraid of what life may throw at me. I feel like I can handle what it throws at me, and I think my husband feels the same way, and it's a really good way to live. And there's a song, one of my songs that I love now, and one of the lines in it says something like, "Even though I'm in the storm is not in me." And that's how I feel now. I feel that I have peace in my heart and always will, and I hope that others can find that peace as well. Thanks for listening.